Hello, we are a group of students from the Worcester Polytechnic Institute in the United States. From March 10th to May 3rd, we assisted the Namibia Business Coalition on AIDS on improving sustainability. More specifically, we looked at the incorporation of a fee-for-service model. My name is Nicole Otto.
I am Giles Chickering.
And I am Kristen, Nich.
We would first like to give you a brief background on Namibia's economic status. As some of you may know, Namibia has one of the highest inequalities in the world. This has in turn generated a huge financial gap between the poor and the rich. The picture to your left shows some of the poorest regions of Namibia, whereas the picture to your right shows some of the richest regions. Together, these pictures depict Namibia as a rich country with poor people. As such, it was a huge surprise that Namibia was recently elevated to upper middle income status by the World Bank. This has resulted in donor institutions such as PEPFAR and the Global Fund to decrease and withdraw funding to the country. More specifically, these two organizations have already revealed exit strategies to decrease financial involvement in programs such as HIV and AIDS. Many are turning towards the private sector for assistance. This graph depicts the funding for HIV/AIDS initiatives from 2007 to 2009. As you can see, most funding for these initiatives came from international organizations or the government. Very little funding has originated from the private sector. As such, many are turning towards the private sector to fill the financial gap resulting from decreased donor funding. One organization that works closely with the private sector to implement programs such as HIV and AIDS to the workforce is the Namibia Business Coalition on AIDS.
The Namibia Business Coalition on AIDS, known as NABCOA, is a non-government organization that was launched in 2003. Its mission is to raise AIDS awareness in the Namibian private sector, and it offers services such as consultations on how to develop HIV workplace programs and policies, peer education training, and monitoring and evaluation. This flowchart demonstrates the membership model under which NABCOA currently operates. Funding for NABCOA's programs originates from major donors such as the Global Fund and GIZ, among others, and then passes through NABCOA, who in turn provides services to Namibian workforces. NABCOA also receives annual membership fees from the businesses that it provides services to. This pie chart shows the breakdown of sources for NABCOA's annual budget. Currently, about 82% of revenue comes from donor funds from international donors like the Global Fund and GIZ. Only 16% of revenue comes from the membership fees paid to NABCOA by private sector companies, and the remaining 2% comes from other fees charged for added services.
Since NABCOA is faced with decreasing funding from donors, it must look towards the private sector to gain revenue to fill the financial gap. One approach to do this would be implementing a fee-for-service model where companies pay for services as they are received. Our goal was to evaluate the interest of companies in switching to this new model and to determine if NABCOA should proceed in restructuring. This graph shows a basic outline for NABCOA's possible fee-for-service model. As more fees are collected from the services that NABCOA provides, the coalition will become less dependent on the donations that are already decreasing. This will help the coalition become more self-sustainable as it begins to generate more income of its own. In order to complete our research, we had three main objectives. The first was to gather background information on the current economic status of Namibia. The second, to evaluate NABCOA's current practices, including their services and service provision. And the third was to evaluate the interest of companies that receive these services in switching to the new fee-for-service model. In order to gather background information about Namibia's current economic status, we met with 15 different government and non-government organizations that do not receive services from NABCOA. With these organizations, we discussed the elevation in economic status in Namibia, HIV and its status in the country, and thoughts on how NABCOA should proceed either with or without changing business models. We also met with 13 companies that have received services from NABCOA and with these companies we discussed their thoughts on HIV in the workplace, satisfaction with NABCOA's services, and asked what types of new services these companies may be looking for.
Next, we evaluated the implementation of a fee-for-service model. Through semi-structured interviews, we were able to ask member companies how willing they were to switch to this new model, as well as what factors they found to be most important while considering this switch. Through all the interviews conducted, we were able to incorporate the following findings and recommendations to our research. For our first finding, we inquired about the severity of HIV and AIDS in the workforce. We asked interviewees to rate severity on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being most severe. As depicted in this graph, the majority of interviewees rated the overall severity to be a 1 or a 3. Not a single interviewee rated severity to be a 5. For our second finding, we looked at the impact of HIV and AIDS with regards to employee morale, decreased productivity, and increase in staff turnover. As depicted by this pie chart, 62% of the companies stated that there has been no impact, with 20% stating that they did not know, and 18% stating that there was an impact, but that this cannot be attributed purely to HIV and AIDS. As a result, we recommend that NABCOA restructure its programs towards wellness. This restructuring would include the rebranding of NABCOA, constructing a new mission, and implementing new services. As seen in findings 1 and 2, member companies do not believe that HIV/AIDS significantly impacts their workforce. Instead, many member companies stated that they would like to see NABCOA shift towards wellness-oriented initiatives.
For our next set of findings, we asked which services companies had received and found that peer education training was the most highly used, with 10 of 13 companies interviewed taking part in these trainings. The refresher courses for the peer education training were also highly received, and many other companies requested these services in the future. Monitoring and evaluation trainings were equally as well received as the peer education refresher courses, with 7 out of 13 companies having taken part. Companies were also asked if they saw a future need for NABCOA's services and were asked to rate the need on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the strongest need. Not a single person rated the need for NABCOA below a 3, and over 50% rated the need for NABCOA's services in the future at a 5, the absolute highest need. We also performed a customer service satisfaction survey during our discussions, during which customers rated NABCOA's services at 3.7 out of 5 on a scale when asked directly. We found, however, that most would go on to later admit a variety of issues with the services being provided. These findings showed the importance of our semi-structured interview method, as we gained both qualitative and quantitative responses that seemed to contradict each other. As NABCOA moves forward, we recommend an improvement in the quality and reliability of the services that the coalition provides. While customers may not be as satisfied as they should be with the services that NABCOA provides, there is still a strong desire for the coalition to continue providing these services to these companies. In order to show the value of the services before NABCOA begins charging fees for them, as NABCOA improves its service quality, we recommend that it focuses on 4 different aspects. The first of which is an improvement in the ability to provide services. The actual trainers and people that physically provide services, such as demonstrations, screenings, and consultations, are adequate in the eyes of customers. However, NABCOA would benefit from having more professionally trained and certified staff members to deliver these services. Communication and follow-up was a major issue that came about in many of our discussions. NABCOA needs to make sure that someone on staff is accountable for organizing and following up on services before and after they are provided. Many services are currently offered when available, and this is based on NABCOA's ability to provide these services when funding and donations are sufficient. We recommend that NABCOA makes sure that these services can be offered at all times, and that if a fee-for-service model is incorporated, that the fees cover the costs of staffing and materials required to deliver these services. Finally, there were a few respondents that requested the quality of distributed materials be improved, as some of the information was presented in an insensitive way and left some confused about the content.
In the final part of our interview process, we asked service receiving companies to indicate on a scale of 1 to 5 how willing they would be to convert to a fee-for-service payment method, and perhaps more importantly, how willing they would be to pay for the services provided. This was important because with the future decreases in donor funding that subsidizes the services, the responsibility of covering the costs will now fall on the private sector. A score of 1 on the scale indicated that they were completely unwilling to convert, and a score of 5 indicated extremely willing. We found that the majority of companies were receptive to the idea of paying through a fee-for-service model, and the most common score was a 5, indicating that the respondent was extremely willing to pay for the services. However, many stipulated that the services would need to be of higher quality. It is also important to note that not a single company chose a score of 1, indicating complete unwillingness to pay for the services. We then asked respondents what the most important factors were when they were considering how willing they were to convert to a fee-for-service model. The most common response was service consistency, followed by service quality and service cost. As an interviewee from the Walvis Bay Corridor Group stated, with service cost being such an important factor, members need to see the value of the programs. For this reason, we recommend that NABCOA improves its marketing strategies. The first step in doing so would be to build an audience within the community. As an interviewee from the Ochi Varango Multipurpose Help Center stated, NABCOA needs to make themselves heard. In this statement, he was referring to NABCOA establishing a presence in the community, which would help it to better advertise its services to a wider range of people. The second step to improving its marketing strategies would be for NABCOA to broaden its appeal to a wider range of people, particularly those in the management departments of potential client companies. Many interviewees stated that health and wellness coordinators see the value of NABCOA's services, but if the management of the company does not, they will not be willing to budget for these services. If NABCOA could appeal to these managers, it could greatly increase NABCOA's customer base. To recap, we believe that NABCOA should follow these steps in order to survive. First, it should restructure its programs toward wellness, and in doing so, improve its service reliability, quality, marketing strategies, and quality of distributed materials. Once these changes have been successfully implemented, NABCOA should then begin to implement a fee-for-service model. Since NABCOA will be one of the first business coalitions in the Southern African region to implement this model, we suggest that a transition period is used to gradually ease NABCOA into its reliance on fees for services rather than donor funds. NABCOA's transition period should look something like the plan shown in this figure, taking a number of years for full implementation to occur, with gradual decreases in external funding from development partners and donors, and a greater reliance on fees for services, which will fill the increasing funding gap. When the transition period is complete, the goal will be for NABCOA to rely almost entirely on the fees it charges for services provided.
We would like to thank everyone involved in the process of researching and completing this project. We would like to specifically thank Mr. Peter Van Wyck, Manini Kanjume, Matthew Black, and the rest of the NABCOA staff. We would also like to thank Professors Nicotina, Robertson, Hirsch, Miss Drew, and all interviewees, as we could not have done this research without them. We would also like to thank Worcester Polytechnic Institute, as well as the Polytechnic of Namibia.